In a museum room in Pompeii, four pale shapes gather against a red wall. One larger figure slumped, the others reclining and upright, a smaller one low at the front. People have stood before them for a century and felt the same thing, that here is the human face of the most famous disaster in history. A family, caught together the moment the world ended. One was buried with a gold bracelet, and for generations that bracelet made her the mother of Pompeii. The pale shapes you are looking at are not bodies, they are plaster, poured into the ground in the 19th century, and in 2024, the question of who these people really were had an answer. To understand how a body becomes a sculpture, you have to go back to the man who first poured the plaster. His name was Giuseppe Fiorelli, and in 1863 he was directing the excavations at Pompeii. By then the site had been dug for more than 100 years, and for most of that century it had been dug badly, the way you would loot a treasure chest. The diggers wanted statues, frescoes, gold, the things you could carry to a museum or sell to a collector, and they went straight through everything else to get them. And every so often, in the hardened ash, they would break into a hollow, an empty pocket, oddly shaped, with a few scraps of bone inside. For 100 years, they had broken through those hollows and thrown the fragments aside, never understanding what they were destroying. Fiorelli understood. He saw that the hollow was the thing, that the empty space itself was the record. So when his men hit one, he told them to stop, to pour liquid plaster into the cavity instead, and to wait for it to set hard before they cleared the surrounding ash away. What rose out of the ground was the shape of a person. Not the bones, those had mostly decayed away centuries ago. The outline of the empty space the person had left behind. The first time it worked, the men were looking at something no one had seen in 1800 years. The exact form of a human being at the moment they died. The fall of the clothing, the turn of the head, the hands at the face. Fiorelli was the hands that poured the plaster. But the protagonist of that scene was not Fiorelli. It was whoever had lain down in that hollow and never got up. A real person, taking shape in plaster. The first of a long line of the dead that we would spend the next century and a half learning how to read. And almost everything we would come to believe about them, we made up. 18 centuries before Fiorelli mixed his plaster, the hollow he poured into had been a living person. When the eruption ended, that person lay buried in volcanic ash, a fine, deep ash that packed in around the body and then hardened over time, almost like setting concrete. And here is the crucial thing. The ash took a perfect impression of the body before the body was gone. Over the centuries that followed, the soft parts decayed first, and then even the bones shrank and crumbled, until what was left inside the rock was an empty cavity. A perfect mould of a vanished body. A negative space, exactly the size and shape and surface of someone who used to be there, down to the weave of the cloth and the line of the jaw. That is what Fiorelli filled. The plaster takes the shape of the absence. So a cast is not a body, and it is not a fossil, and it is not a photograph. It is a sculpture, cast from a void, the way bronze is cast in a mould. And like any sculpture pulled from a mould, it came out of the ground rough and broken and incomplete, missing pieces, fragile, joined together from fragments. And someone had to decide what to do with it, how to mend it, how to stand it, how to present it. The archaeologist Estelle Lazare, who spent years studying these objects, put it as plainly as anyone has. The casts, she said, are a bit more art than science. That word, art, is the whole story. Because if the cast is the shape of an absence, then everything we think we see in it, the pose, the gesture, the family it belongs to, the last thing it was feeling, none of that is in the plaster itself. All of it came from somewhere outside. It came from us. What followed, over the next century and a half, is the story of where, and of the men, one after another, who looked at a rough plaster shape pulled out of the dirt and decided what it should mean. Europe already knew exactly how to feel about Pompeii 30 years before Fiorelli poured a single drop of plaster, and it learned that feeling from a painting of an event no living person had ever seen. In 1833, a Russian painter named Karl Bryullov finished an enormous canvas called The Last Day of Pompeii. It is wider than a room, and it is pure opera. The sky split with red light, marble columns toppling in mid-fall, beautiful people in white robes frozen at the height of their terror, a mother gathering her grown daughters under her, a child reaching across the stones toward a fallen parent. Bryullov spent years on it. When he showed it, it became one of the most famous paintings in the world. It travelled. People stood in front of it and wept. The poets of the age wrote verses about it. And not one of those figures was real. Bryullov had never seen a single one of the dead of Pompeii, because in 1833 nobody had, anywhere. The casting technique that would reveal them was still 30 years away. So he did what a painter does. He imagined the catastrophe and staged it and lit it the way you would direct a tragedy on a stage, choosing who falls where and who reaches for whom. A year later, an English novelist named Edward Bulwer Lytton did the same thing in words, and arguably he did it even more powerfully, because a novel can give you names. He took the ruins, which were just streets and walls, and filled them with characters. A noble young hero, the woman he loves, a sinister Egyptian priest, and, most famous of all, a blind flower girl who, when the dark comes down and everyone else is helpless, is the one person who can lead the survivors to the sea, because she has spent her whole life finding her way without light. The book was a phenomenon. It sold for generations, it was made into plays and films, and for a very long time it was simply how educated Europe pictured the place. So, by the time the real bodies started coming out of the ground, the audience was already trained. They had already been taught what Pompeii meant, a city of beautiful innocence caught in the middle of ordinary life and struck down together in a single divine instant, and they had been taught it by a painter and a novelist who were working entirely from imagination. And the city those two men imagined was not the city that actually died. What survives at Pompeii, one historian put it bluntly, is emphatically not a frozen moment in the life of a community going about its normal business, but the traces of a city abandoned and already half stripped. The real Pompeii of AD 79 was not a postcard. 17 years earlier, a major earthquake had badly damaged the town, and when Vesuvius erupted, the city was still, all those years later, a building site. Walls half rebuilt and propped up, whole houses standing empty mid-renovation, furniture and valuables already moved out of rooms that were being worked on. Some scholars think a good part of the population had already drifted away from a city that was, frankly, a construction zone. The image we cherish, the eggs still warm on the table, the loaf of bread still in the oven, the family caught at an ordinary breakfast, that is the Bryullov painting and the Bulwer Lytton novel, not the archaeology. We inherited a painting, and then, when the casts came up out of the ground, we used them to confirm the painting instead of the other way around. We had decided what Pompeii meant before we ever met the dead. So if a painter could invent the feeling, and a novelist could invent the characters, the obvious question is, what happened the day someone could finally photograph the real thing? And the answer is the most unsettling turn in the whole story. When Fiorelli's casts began emerging from the excavations in the 1860s, they became, almost at once, a sensation. He even built a little museum on the site to display them, and they pulled in the tourists, because by then Pompeii was a fixed stop on the Grand Tour, the long circuit of Italy that every educated, well-off Northern European was expected to make. People came for the ruins, and now there was something far stronger than ruins. They were the dead themselves, or what looked like them. And where there are tourists, there is someone selling them a souvenir. The man who got there first was a commercial photographer named Giorgio Somma, working in Naples in the 1870s, who sold prints to the visitors, and the plaster casts were his best-selling subject. But Somma did not simply photograph the dead where they lay. He arranged them. He moved the casts, posed them, set them in compositions, lit them for effect, and sold the resulting pictures as souvenirs of a real catastrophe, faithful images of how the people of Pompeii had died. A real 19th century camera, the new machine that everyone trusted to tell the literal truth, was being used to compose the dead of Pompeii into a sellable picture. And then that picture was carried home, across Europe, framed on a wall, passed around, believed. The cast had come up out of the dirt, rough and broken. Somma's photograph could make it tender, or tragic, or peaceful, or beautiful, depending entirely on how he set the light and turned the head. The catch in your chest when you look at a Pompeii victim today, that exact feeling was being manufactured and sold 150 years ago, frame by frame, by a man with a tripod and a price list. So here is the first real piece of the answer to the question we started with. How much of what we feel about Pompeii did someone make for us? Yes, a real Victorian camera really did arrange these bodies for sale, and the feeling came packaged with the print. Somma sold the feeling. The next man would write the family. In 1961, the excavator Amedeo Maiuri uncovered a group of 13 people who had died together near a garden wall at the southern edge of the city, and cast them where they fell. The place is still called today the Garden of the Fugitives, because of the story Maiuri told about it. And the story is the second half of what we are tracing, because it is where the casts stop being shapes and become people with relationships. He did the thing that turned 13 strangers into the image you carry in your head. He wrote their story. He published it in National Geographic under the title The Last Moments of the Pompeians, and he told the world who these 13 were to one another, the relationships, the families. Which of them was a parent and which a child, who had been carrying the household's last few coins, who was reaching for whom in the final seconds against that wall. It was vivid, and it was genuinely moving, and people have repeated it ever since. It is one of the most reproduced groups in all of Pompeii. It was also, as far as the actual evidence goes, almost entirely invented. The backstories Maiuri wrote are now considered largely fictitious. He had 13 plaster bodies and a wall and a powerful imagination. The families were his. This is the same instinct, one more turn of the screw. Brjullov gave Pompeii a feeling. Somma gave it a composition. Maiuri gave it kinship. He looked at strangers and named them mother, son, sister, and we believed him, because a group of people dying together asks to be a family. You can watch the instinct produce a story even now, with the most famous of all the Pompeii casts that is not a human one, the dog. There is a cast of a dog at the house of Orpheus, twisted on its back, and the story everyone tells is that it was chained up when the ash began to fall, and that it climbed the rising ash all night to stay above it, until at dawn it reached the end of its chain and could climb no higher. It is a perfect, unbearable little story. There is no evidence for any of it. The cast of the dog is real. The all-night climb is something the guides and the guidebooks tell, because it is the story we want a dying, chained dog to have. 13 strangers became a family the day Maiuri named them. And yet, for all their stories, there was one thing none of these men could do. Maiuri named these 13, and he never knew who a single one of them was. Nobody did. Not yet. But a real mourning made the void that Maiuri filled. 13 people really did die against that wall. So leave the museum for a while and go back to the day itself. Not as a list of what the volcano did, but as it was lived by one of them. Picture a man in Pompeii on the early afternoon the mountain opened. We do not have his name, we never will. But people like him left their shapes in the ash, and the science lets us reconstruct his 18 hours with real confidence. It begins as a curiosity almost. Around the middle of the day, a column of cloud climbs off the top of Vesuvius, taller than anything he has ever seen, far taller than the mountain itself, and it keeps climbing until it spreads at the very top into a flat, dark canopy. Across the bay, far to the west, a boy of 17 named Pliny is watching the same cloud from his uncle's house. And a quarter of a century later, he will write the only eyewitness account of this day that survives. It looked, he wrote, more like a pine tree than anything else, a long trunk of cloud branching out at the top. The umbrella pine of Italy, the kind that stands over every Roman road, turned to ash and standing higher than any mountain. For our man, in the city directly under it, the sky is going dark in the early afternoon. And then the trouble starts. And it starts not with fire, but with stones. White pumice, light, porous volcanic rock, the kind that floats on water, begins to rain down on the city, and it does not stop. For hours it falls, hour after hour, piling in the streets, drifting against the doors, building up on every flat roof in Pompeii. He can hear it, a steady hiss and rattle, the whole city ticking under it. By evening it has turned grey and coarser, and there is more than a metre of it lying in the streets, and still it keeps coming. This is his first real decision, and it is the one that killed about a third of everyone who died at Pompeii. Stay inside, under a roof, and the roof may come down on top of you. 1.5 meters of wet volcanic rock is an enormous weight, and across the city that night the roofs began to give way. The pumice did it, and recent work suggests so did earthquakes, the ground shaking the already loaded buildings until they failed. Go outside instead, into the dark, into the falling stone, with a cushion or a tile held over your head against it, and you might be struck down in the open. Roughly a third of Pompeii's dead never lived to see the surge that everyone remembers. They died on the first night, under their own houses or in their own streets, while the famous part of the eruption had not yet even begun. But say our man chooses to run and gets clear of the roofs in time. He has hours. That is the part the melodrama always erases. From the columns first rising to the surge that finally killed the people still inside was something like 18 hours, the better part of a full day and a night. 18 hours of falling stone and deepening dark, in which most of the city made exactly his choice and walked out through the gates while they still could. The roads south and east out of Pompeii filled with people carrying what they could carry, children, a lamp, whatever a life weighs when you have an hour to choose. Out at sea the same day, something stranger was happening. Pliny, the boy across the bay, watched the water itself pull back from the shore. The sea drawn back upon itself, he wrote, as if the earth were shrugging it off, leaving fish stranded on the dry sand. The whole bay was convulsing, and then the dark came down fully. Then the blackness of night overtook us, he wrote, not that of a moonless or cloudy night, but the blackness of pent-up places which never see the light. And in that blackness, he wrote, you could hear the wailing of women, the screams of little children, and the shouts of men. People calling for each other by name in a dark they could not see through. Some convinced the last night of the world had come. If our man got out in those 18 hours, he lived, and we will come back to where people like him went. But if he stayed, to wait it out, to guard a house, to dig for someone trapped, to help somebody who could not walk, then the morning came for him. Around 7:30 on the second day, a pyroclastic surge swept down off the mountain and across the town. A surge is the thing the old story never had a word for. Not lava, not falling ash, but a fast, low, ground-hugging cloud of hot gas and ash and rock, moving faster than anyone can run. The night before, one of these had already come down the slope and stopped just short of the walls, near enough to terrify, not near enough to kill. This one did not stop. When it reached Pompeii, it killed everyone still inside the walls, in minutes. Not everyone in the region died the same death, and this is the single most important thing to get right about how Pompeii works. The nearer town of Herculaneum had been hit first, hours earlier, by a surge far hotter, somewhere around 500 degrees, hot enough that soft tissue did not survive at all. There are no casts at Herculaneum. There was nothing left to leave a hollow. Pompeii's surge was cooler, a few hundred degrees, and that difference is the entire reason this video exists. At Pompeii, the bodies were buried whole and left their shapes in the ash, and at Herculaneum they were not. The casts are a product of a temperature. One man we do have a name for died on a shore nearby that morning, and his death tells us something the casts cannot. The elder Pliny, uncle of the boy across the bay, was commander of the Roman fleet, and when the cloud first rose, he ordered out the warships, not to flee, but to cross toward the mountain. He went first out of pure curiosity to see the thing up close, and then, when a message came begging for rescue with a fleet's full purpose, to take people off the beaches under the ashfall. "Fortune favours the bold," his nephew records him saying as the ships put out. He reached the far shore, came aground at a friend's villa, and there, with the pumice piling against the doors, he is said to have eaten dinner, or pretended to, and slept, or pretended to keep the household from panic. He did not make it back. When the air near the shore grew too thick to breathe, he went down on the beach, and that is where they found him days later, lying on the sand, intact and unmarked. Looking, his nephew wrote, more like a person asleep than a dead man. He was not burned. He was not torn. Whatever killed him there was not the searing surge that took the closer town. The heat never reached him. The popular story that he died of poison gas is not really what the letter describes either. It reads more like an older man with a weak chest simply giving out in bad air on a terrible night. A quiet, honest forensic detail, hiding inside a famous letter for 2,000 years. This is the morning that made the void. 18 centuries before anyone poured plaster into it. And the person who made it, the man or the woman who lay down in that ash and left their shape behind, has still, to this moment, never had a name. And here is how deep the not knowing runs. In the ruins of the public baths, archaeologists found a tortoise. It had crawled into a quiet corner to lay its eggs, and it died there, still carrying them. A tortoise lays its eggs in early summer, which is a problem because for centuries everyone knew exactly when Pompeii died. The 24th of August, AD 79, the date Pliny gives in his letters. The tortoise was not laying eggs in late August, and it certainly was not laying them in October. That second date is the strange part, because the excavation park itself cannot keep its own story straight. In 2018, on a wall in a half-dug house, archaeologists found a date scratched in charcoal that read like the middle of October, and announced that Pompeii had died 2 months later than anyone thought. Then the same park ran an experiment to check it, leaving fresh charcoal writing exposed to see how long it stayed legible, and found it could last many months, which means the October scribble does not actually date the eruption at all. The current director has since said the October date has no documentary basis. The site found the clue, then disproved its own clue. Meanwhile, the autumn camp still has the rest of the dirt on its side, pomegranates and walnuts from the fall harvest, jars of wine sealed for fermentation the way you do in October, heavy clothing on some of the casts. The pages say August, the ground says autumn, the tortoise says neither. We cannot even agree what month the most famous day in Roman history happened, and it turns out that not knowing is a pattern. Until very recently, we did not know how they died either, or who they were. For a long time, the textbook answer to how the people of Pompeii died was simple and wrong. They were slowly buried alive, the story went, smothered as the ash piled up over them, choking by inches under a sky that fell on them for hours, even days. It is a horrible image, and it is the one most of us grew up with. And it is not what happened. The people who died on the second day were not slowly buried. They were caught by the surge, that fast, hot, ground-hugging cloud, in a matter of minutes, and in many cases, probably less. The picture of a whole city smothered grain by grain under a gently falling sky is one of the first things the modern science cleared away. But clearing away the wrong answer turned out to be much easier than agreeing on the right one. In 2010, a team went further and argued something startling. Heat, they said, was the main cause of death, for people, in their words, heretofore supposed to have died by ash suffocation. On their reading, the surge was so hot and so fast that it killed instantly before anyone could choke. And they reread the casts in light of that. You know the famous pose, the contorted figure with its fists drawn up, long described as a victim flinching from the horror, throwing up its arms to defend itself. That team said no. This is not a gesture of fear. It is what intense heat does to a body after death, drawing the muscles tight. The boxer pose is a heat artifact. It is not the person's last conscious act. That correction has held. The postures tell you about temperature, not about anyone's final thought. The flinching, defensive reading of the boxer pose is gone. But the bigger claim that heat killed them all instantly did not settle the question the way it first seemed to. If anything, it reopened it. Because the most recent work, looking specifically at Pompeii, has swung partway back the other way. Studies in the last few years have argued that Pompeii's surge was cooler than the instant death model requires. Cool enough that the bodies survived to be cast at all, and that the deadly cloud lingered over the city long enough, on the order of 17 minutes, that people could have died not from a flash of heat, but from breathing fine ash until they could not breathe at all. 17 minutes is a long time to die. One recent study, looking at the casts themselves, comes down on it plainly. They support asphyxia. So the two most recent Pompeii-specific readings both lean back towards suffocation, at the lower end of the temperatures, not the instant thermal death. So we are left with an honest answer instead of a clean one, and the honest answer is more interesting than either tidy version. The old slow burial story, days of smothering, was wrong, and the science overturned it for good. But what replaced it is genuinely still being argued. Was it instant heat, or suffocation over a quarter of an hour? Or some of each, in different parts of the city for different people, depending on exactly where they were when the cloud arrived? We do not know. A third of them, remember, were already dead before any of this, killed the night before under their roofs. And the gorier claims you may have heard, the skulls said to have burst, the blood said to have boiled, the one brain reported to have turned to glass, those all belong to Herculaneum, the closer, hotter town, not to Pompeii. And even at Herculaneum, the scientists who proposed them were careful. The most dramatic of those papers calls itself, in its own title, a hypothesis, and admits it has only indirect evidence. The most lurid Pompeii stories are not even about Pompeii. We can say how most of them died, the surge, not slow burial. We cannot yet say, for any single one of them, exactly what came first, the heat or the dark. For one group of them, though, a question much older than how they died was about to be answered. Not how, who. In 2015, a team led by the archaeologist Estelle Lazaire did something nobody had done since the casts first came out of the ground. They put them through a medical scanner to see, for the first time, what was actually inside them. They scanned 26 of them. What the scans showed was not what the surfaces promised. The casts, the team reported, had been considerably manipulated. Bones were often removed prior to casting, and other elements had been introduced. Inside these tender, grieving figures, the conservators of earlier generations had quietly been at work, taking bones out where they got in the way, building the plaster up where the impression was thin. And, the cast project describes, running metal rods and armatures through the figures to hold a pose upright, the way a statue is built around an iron skeleton. A figure you have stood in front of and felt your throat tighten may have a steel rod where you imagined a spine. The cast is not a real body wearing a thin skin of plaster. In places, it is plaster and metal all the way through. And the same close-looking dissolved the smaller myths the casts had carried for generations too. The idea that the dead of Pompeii had unusually perfect teeth, taken as a sign of some healthy ancient diet. The idea that only the weak, the old, the sick, the people who could not run, had been left behind to die. Those stories fall apart too. They were things we had read into the plaster, not things the plaster actually said. Brjullov painted it, Sommer posed it, Maiuri named it, and the restorers, with chisels and plaster and steel, physically built it. Every single layer of feeling we have about these objects was put there by a human hand. So when we stand before the figure with the gold bracelet, the mother of Pompeii, the adult curled over the child, and ask what is actually inside it, the scanner can answer part of that. It can show the metal and the plaster and the missing bone, but it cannot tell you who the person was. For that, the casts had to give up something they had been keeping for 2,000 years. In 2024, a team sampled the DNA still trapped in the bone fragments inside the casts. And the most beloved story in all of Pompeii came apart in a single sentence. The figure with the gold bracelet, the adult curled protectively over the child, the mother of Pompeii, was not a mother. The DNA was unambiguous. In the team's own words, all individuals were sexed as genetically male, including the presumed female adult, and no evidence of biological relatedness between any of the individuals. The mother was an adult man. The child he seemed to be shielding was not his child, was not related to him at all. The gold bracelet that named him a woman for 150 years was just a bracelet on a man's wrist in the dark. And it was not only that one. Take the other most famous group of all, the pair found together so closely entwined that they have been described for generations as two embracing sisters, or sometimes as two lovers caught in a final hold. The DNA found a male among them, and it found no kinship between them at all, not sisters, not, on the evidence, related in any way. One by one, the relationships came undone. None of the famous family of the gold bracelet were family. They were strangers who happened to die near one another in the dark, and across a century and a half, we made them into parents and children and sisters and lovers, because that is what human beings do with the dead. We give them to each other. The team who ran the test were careful, almost gentle, about what their own finding meant. They did not call the casts fakes. The casts are real plaster, poured around the real remains of real people who really died there. What the scientists pointed at was the stories. It is possible, they wrote, that the use of the casts as vehicles for storytelling led the restorers of the past to manipulate the poses and the relative positioning of the figures, to arrange them, in other words, into the relationships the public wanted to see. The kinship was authored. The poses may have been nudged toward the story. The grief over these figures was always real. It was simply pointed at a relationship that the people in the plaster never had. What the DNA could give back was different from what we had wanted, and quieter. Not a name, not a relationship, but the deep ancestry of these people. Their roots, it turned out, reached back largely to the Eastern Mediterranean, to populations from around the Aegean and the Near East, a reminder that Roman Italy was a place people had come to from a long way off, that the dead of Pompeii were not some single local stock, but the mixed, mobile population of a port empire. And there is what the DNA did not say. It said nothing about how these people died or how the casts formed. It answered one question only: who? The grief was never misplaced, it was only misaddressed. A real person did die, curled over a real child in the dark, 18 hours into the worst day of their life. We simply invented who they were to each other. Which leaves the question we have been carrying since the first minute. If the man with the bracelet was not a mother, who was he? And the honest answer turns on the largest fact about Pompeii that we keep forgetting. Most of them lived. Remember the 18 hours. From the moment the column rose to the moment the killing surge came was the better part of a day and a night, and most of Pompeii used it. The majority of the city got out. The dead we have cast and named and photographed and wept over for 150 years are the ones who, for whatever reason, stayed, and they were never the whole city, or anything close to most of it. How many died exactly we cannot say. The death toll is an estimate with a wide range, and the city's population before the eruption is itself an estimate with a wide range, and there is no census to check either against. So no honest version of this gives you a clean percentage. But the shape of it is not in doubt. The famous, terrible image of total annihilation, a city wiped out to the last soul, is wrong. Most people walked out of those gates and lived, and they did not simply vanish into the countryside. Research by the classicist Stephen Tuck suggests we can trace more than 200 of them by name after the eruption. The method is to look for distinctive Pompeian family names turning up afterward in the records of other towns around the bay and up the coast, places like Ostia and Puteoli and Nuceria and Beneventum, towns that took the refugees in. Tuck finds these names appearing in new cities, in inscriptions and on monuments, evidence of people who got out of Pompeii and then, somewhere else, married, had children, paid for public buildings, served on town councils, rebuilt entire lives. On that reading, Pompeii is less a city of the dead than a place whose people mostly became refugees and started again somewhere up the coast. His survivor tracing rests on inscriptions, and the underlying study is the kind of work still being weighed by other scholars, so hold the exact number lightly. But the direction of it is the thing that matters, and it is the opposite of the story we tell. The most famous catastrophe in history was, for thousands of ordinary people, a thing they survived and grieved and then lived a long time past. And the ruins themselves were never quite abandoned either. For centuries after the eruption, one recent study suggests, Poorer survivors and scavengers moved back onto the buried city. They lived among the upper floors and the rooftops still sticking out of the ash, dug down into the dead houses for the bronze and marble left behind, and made a rough, persistent settlement on top of the grave, which lasted until another eruption, generations later, finally drove them off for good. Life went back into the dead city almost at once. The famous dead are the ones who stayed. The city, mostly, walked away. Which leaves the ones who did not, and the long, strange thing we have done with them ever since. A great deal has happened to this figure, and to the casts like it, since the day they came up out of the ground. They were poured in plaster and pulled from the voids. They were posed and photographed and sold across Europe by the thousand. They were written into families in a magazine. They were caught in the Second World War, when an air raid struck the building where the casts were kept, and a number of them were smashed in the blast. Some of the most famous Pompeians, having survived the eruption as voids and the centuries as cavities, were destroyed in the 20th century by a bomb. Decades later, one body was cast again, this time in clear resin instead of plaster, so that for the first time you could look through the surface and see the bones held inside. They were put through a scanner. They gave up their DNA. And this year, the best preserved of them are going back on display in a new exhibition, in a clean, cool light, for yet another generation to stand in front of and feel something. Every one of those was a new technology, and every one of them was the same act. Paint, then the camera, then the excavator's pen, then the scanner, then the genome. Each generation reached for the newest tool it had and used it to make an anonymous shape mean something. And each generation believed, for a while, that its tool had finally found the person. The painter thought he had captured the feeling. The photographer thought he had captured the scene. The excavator thought he had recovered the family. The geneticist now has recovered the most that anyone ever has, a sex, an ancestry, the fact of no kinship. The figure with the gold bracelet has been a mother, a victim, a tourist photograph, a printed family, a scan, a genome. It has been everything we knew how to make it. It has been everything except the one thing none of our tools has ever given back: its name. So stand before it one more time, now, knowing what you know. The pale, rough plaster. The patched places where a chisel worked, where a hand 150 years ago decided how this person should look to you. The faint line of an armature, maybe, holding the pose. The shape of a body that decayed away 1700 years before anyone poured anything into the space it left. It is not a photograph of a death. It never was. It is the most carefully made thing in the room. We did not come to Pompeii for the truth. We came for the story, the mother, the sisters, the dog at the end of its rope. And the men who dug up the dead gave us the story because we wanted it, and because underneath the invented family there really was a person, and a story is the only thing we know how to make out of a silence this complete. You cannot stand in front of a human shape pulled out of the ash and feel nothing, and you cannot feel something and leave it shapeless. So we gave it a shape, a mother, a family, a faithful dog. The DNA did not hand the mother back. Nothing will. We are not going to learn this person's name, or who they ran with through the dark, or what they were thinking when they lay down in the ash and pulled a stranger's child in close. The plaster keeps all of that. It always did. What we are left holding is not the person. It is the long human habit of standing before the unknowable dead and making them mean something, with whatever tool we happen to have in our hands. Paint, a camera, an excavator's pen, a scanner, a genome. And we are doing it again, right now, with the newest instrument we have ever held. And we are just as certain as every generation before us that this time, finally, we have found the person. The painter was certain. The photographer was certain. The man who named the family was certain. The next generation will have a tool we cannot picture, and they will stand exactly where you are standing now, in front of the same silent plaster, and they will reach for it. What it shows them, and whether it brings them 1 inch closer to whoever was actually here, lying in the dark 18 hours into the end of their world, we cannot say. We only know that they will look. We always do.